The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Durant. Chapter 25, Egypt and the West, Section 2, Socialism under the Ptolemies. By far, the most interesting aspect of Ptolemaic Egypt is its extensive experiment in state socialism. Royal ownership of the land had long been a sacred custom in Egypt. The pharaoh, as king and self-proclaimed god, had full right to the soil and all that it had produced. The fellah was not a slave, but he could not leave his place without the permission of the government, and he was required to turn over the larger part of his crops to the state. The Ptolemies accepted this system and extended it by appropriating the great tracts, which, under previous dynasties, had belonged to the Egyptian nobles or priests, a great bureaucracy of governmental overseers, supported by armed guards, managed all Egypt as a vast state farm. Nearly every peasant in Egypt was told by these officials what soil to till and what crops to grow. His labor and his animals could at any time be requisitioned by the state for mining, building, hunting, and making of canals or roads. His harvest was gauged by state measurers, registered by the scribes, threshed on the royal threshing floor, and conveyed by a living chain of fellahs into the granaries of the king. There were exceptions to the system. The Ptolemies allowed the farmer to own his house and garden. They resigned the cities to private property, and they gave a right of leasehood to soldiers whose services were rewarded with land. But this leasehood was usually confined to areas which the owner agreed to devote to vineyards, orchards, or olive groves. It excluded the power of bequest and might at any time be cancelled by the king. As Greek energy and skill improved these klerarchic shareholders' lands, a demand rose for the right to transmit the property from father to son. In the 2nd century, such bequest was permitted by custom, but not by law. In the last century before Christ, it was recognized by law, and the usual evolution from common property to private property was complete. Doubtless this system of socialism had been evolved because the conditions of tillage in Egypt required more cooperation, more unison of action in time and space than individual ownership could be expected to provide. The amount and character of the crops to be sown depended upon the extent of the annual inundation and the efficiency of irrigation and drainage. These matters naturally made for central control. Greek engineers, in the employ of the government, improved ancient processes and applied a more scientific and intensive agriculture to the land. The ancient shadoof was replaced by the noria, a large wheel, sometimes 40 feet in diameter, equipped with buckets hanging freely on the interior rim. At the top of the revolution, each bucket was tilted by an obstructing bar and emptied its contents into an irrigation reservoir. Better still, the screw of Archimedes and the pump of Chrysippus raised water with a speed unknown before the Ptolemies. See Chapter 27. The centralization of economic management in the hands of the government and the institution of forced labor made possible great public works of flood control, road construction, irrigation, and building, and prepared the way for the engineering feats of Rome. Ptolemy II drained Lake Moeris and turned its bed into a great tract of fertile land for distribution among the soldiers. In 285, he began to restore the canal from the Nile near Heliopolis to the Red Sea near Suez. Pharaoh Necho and Darius I had built and rebuilt this, but twice the shifting sands had choked it up, as in a century they would do again. Industry operated under similar conditions. The government not only owned the mines, but either worked them itself or appropriated the ore. The Ptolemies opened up valuable gold deposits in Nubia and had a stable gold coinage. They controlled the copper mines of Cyprus and Sinai. They had a monopoly of oil, derived not from the soil, but from the plants like linseed, crofton, and sesame. The government fixed each year the amount of land to be sown to such plants. It took the whole produce at its own price. It extracted the oil in state factories through great beam presses worked by serfs. It sold the oil to realtors at its own price and excluded foreign competition by a heavy tariff. Its profit ranged from 70 to 300%. Apparently, there were similar government subsidies in salt, natron, carbonate of soda, used as soap, also used in preservation of various things, including human bodies, incense, papyrus, and textiles. There were some private textile factories, but they had to sell all their products to the state. Minor industries were left in private hands. The state merely licensed and supervised them, bought a large share of their output at fixed prices, and taxed a good part of the profits into the royal treasury. Handicrafts were carried on by ancient guilds whose members were by tradition bound to their trade, their village, even to their domicile. Industry was well developed. Chariots, furniture, terracotta, carpets, cosmetics were produced in abundance. Glass blowing and the weaving of linen were Alexandrian specialities. Invention was more advanced in Ptolemaic Egypt than in any economy before imperial Rome's. The screw chain, the wheel chain, the cam chain, the ratchet chain, the pulley chain, and the screw press were all in use, and the chemistry of dyes had progressed to the point of treating cloths with diverse reagents, which brought forth from immersion in one dye a variety of fast colors. In general, the factories of Alexandria were worked by slaves whose low cost of maintenance enabled the Ptolemies to undersell in foreign trade the products of Greek handicraft. All commerce was controlled and regulated by the government. Retail traders were usually state agents distributing state goods. All caravan routes and waterways were owned by the state. Ptolemy II introduced the camel into Egypt and organized a camel post to the south. This carried only governmental communications, but these included nearly all the commercial correspondence of the country. The Nile was busy with passenger and freight traffic, apparently under private management, subject to state regulation. For the Mediterranean trade, the Ptolemies built the largest commercial fleet of the time, with vessels of 300 tons burden. The warehouses of Alexandria invited world trade. Its double harbor was the envy of other cities. Its lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders. The fields, factories, and workshops of Egypt supplied a great surplus, which found markets as far east as China, as far south as Central Africa, as far north as Russia and the British Isles. Egyptian explorers sailed down to Zanzibar and Somaliland, and told the world about the troglodytes, who lived on the East African coast on seafood, ostriches, carrots, and roots. To break the Arab hold on Indian trade with the Near East, Egyptian ships sailed directly from the Nile to Egypt. Under the West encouragement of the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the leading port of shipment for Eastern merchandise, designed for the markets of the Mediterranean. Now, that sub-Saharan or, are they referring just to that race just south of Egypt, you could say, that nowadays, particularly because of the commonness of training with the Quran and their diet, that they consistently produce of the smartest people in the world, which refutes that whole idea that intelligence is just a brain-sized thing. Because if them and the people over by Gambia, Senegal, also consistently produce of the top intelligent people of the world, same thing, a diet rich in fish and certain vegetables and whole grains and stuff, and, you know, religious training, you know, trained with material, I mean, you know. This flowering of commerce and industry was quickened by excellent banking conveniences. I mean, you know, they do look a bit different than the Europeans, but, you know, because their heads have more space for air to cool, and they don't have some of the warming features that the Europeans have, or the northern Asians. But, you know, different people have different tastes in what they like as far as appearances, right? Payment in kind survived to some degree as a legacy from ancient Egypt, and the grain of the royal treasuries was used as part of the bank reserve, but deposits, withdrawals, and transfers of grain might be made on paper instead of being physically performed. Beside this modified barter, rose a complex money economy. Banking was a government monopoly, but its operations might be delegated to private firms. Bills were paid by drafts on bank balances. Banks lent money at interest and paid the accounts of the royal treasury. The central bank at Alexandria had branches in all the important towns. Never in known history had agriculture, industry, commerce, and finance rich, so unified, and so brutal a development. And, okay, the lighthouse, 7 wonders. Sostratus of Cnidus designed the lighthouse for Ptolemy II at a cost of 800 talents, about $2.4 million, 1939 US. It rose in several setbacks to a height of 400 feet. It was covered with white marble and adorned with sculptures in marble and bronze. Above the pillared cupola that contained the light rose, a 21-foot statue of Poseidon. The flame came from the burning of resinous wood and was made visible probably by convex metal mirrors to a distance of 38 miles. The structure was completed in 279 BCE and was destroyed in the 3rd century of the Common Era. The island of Pharos, on which it stood, is now the Ras et Tin quarter of Alexandria. The site of the lighthouse has been covered by the sea. You know, because there was a warming period back then, and, you know, the sea level used to be lower. The masters and beneficiaries of the system were the free Greeks of the capital. At the head of all was the pharaoh, god-king. From the viewpoint of the Greek population, the Ptolemy was truly a satar, or savior, satir, a euergetes, or benefactor. He gave them 100,000 places in the bureaucracy, endless economic opportunities, unprecedented faculties for the life of the mind, and a wealthy court as the source and center of a luxurious social life. Nor was the king an incalculable despot. Egyptian tradition combined with Greek law to build up a system of legislation which borrowed from and improved upon the Athenian code in every respect except freedom. The edicts of the king had full legal force, but the cities enjoyed considerable self-government, and the Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish population lived under its own system of law, chose its own magistrates, and pled before its own courts. A Turin papyrus gives the record of an Alexandrian lawsuit. The issues are precisely defined, the evidence is carefully presented, precedents are summarized, and the final judgment is given with judicial impartiality. Other papyri preserves Alexandrian wills and reveal the antiquity of legal forms. This is the will of Pysius, the Lucian, son of X, of sound mind and deliberate intention. The Ptolemaic was the most efficiently organized government in the Hellenistic world. It took its national form from Egypt and Persia, its municipal form from Greece, and passed them on to imperial Rome. The country was divided into nomes or provinces, each administered by the appointees of the king. Nearly all these officials were Greek. The idea of Alexander, that Greek and Oriental or Egyptian should live and mingle on equal terms, was forgotten as unlucrative. The valley of the Nile became frankly a conquered land. The Greek overseers brought an advanced technology and management to the economic life of Egypt and enormously expanded the wealth of the nation, but they took the increase. The state charged high prices for the products which it controlled and barred competition with a tariff wall. Hence, olive oil that cost 21 drachmas in Delos cost 52 in Alexandria. Everywhere the government took rentals, taxes, customs, and tolls, sometimes labor and life itself. The government of my country is undoing itself by overtaxing. And of course, they write it in such a way that the rich, through their companies, can redirect their taxes to be paid by the employees. My whole life, I've seen or heard of it, of relatives and other people that had to pay their employers' taxes. The peasant paid a fee to the state for the right to keep cattle, for the fodder that he fed them, and for the privilege of grazing them on the common pasture land. The private owner of gardens, vineyards, or orchards paid a sixth under Ptolemy II, a half of his produce to the state. All persons except soldiers, priests, and governmental officials paid a poll tax. There were taxes on salt, legal documents, and bequests, a 5% tax on rentals, a 10% tax on sales, a 25% levy on all fish caught in Egyptian waters, a toll on goods passing from village to town or along the Nile. There were high exports as well as import duties on all Egyptian ports. There were special taxes to maintain the fleet and the lighthouse, to keep the municipal physicians and police in good humor, and to buy a gold crown for every new king. Nothing was overlooked that could fatten the state. To keep track of all taxable products, income, and transactions, the government maintained a swarm of scribes and a vast system of personal and property registration. To collect the taxes, it farmed them out to specialists, supervised their operations, and held their possessions as security till the returns were in. The local revenue of the Ptolemies in money and kind was probably the greatest gathered by any government between the fall of Persia and the ascendancy of Rome. And see, that's one of the things in anything resembling a religious government, is the taxes are lower, and people look at, oh, well, there's some sort of differences between one group and the other. It's like, yeah, but they got more freedom and security and stuff than they do in other systems.